The Cold War era witnessed the construction of over 400 classified military installations across the continental United States, many of them hidden deep in remote wilderness areas where prying Soviet satellites couldn't easily monitor American defense capabilities. Between 1955 and 1991, the Pentagon spent an estimated $2.3 trillion on these black sites, creating an invisible network of underground bunkers, research facilities, and communication hubs that formed the backbone of America's nuclear deterrent strategy. Fort Blackwood, officially designated as Training Facility Alpha 7 on declassified documents, was one of these ghost installations, a sprawling complex built into the granite bedrock of the Colorado Rockies, where over 3,000 military personnel conducted exercises so classified that their families were told they worked at a weather monitoring station. The facility's official closure in 1987 came without fanfare or public announcement. Just another line item buried in a defense appropriations bill that few congressmen bothered to read. What the Pentagon didn't tell anyone, not the families of the servicemen, not the local communities, not even most of the brass who signed the decommission orders, was why Fort Blackwood had to be abandoned so suddenly. The official story spoke of budget cuts and changing strategic priorities, but the real reason was locked away in files marked Eyes Only and stored in vaults that required presidential authorization to access. Entire wings of the facility had been sealed with concrete and steel, their corridors filled with industrial foam, as if the military was trying to suffocate something rather than simply shut it down. But some secrets refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the grave or how thick you pour the concrete. And some experiments leave echoes that resonate long after the last scientist has packed up his equipment and driven away into the Colorado sunset. Master Sergeant Jake Reaper Morrison had seen enough classified bullshit in his 22 years of service to know when the Army was feeding him a line, but even he couldn't have predicted what waited for them inside the rusted gates of Fort Blackwood. The 34-year-old Special Operations veteran from Tulsa, Oklahoma, had been handpicked to lead a small reconnaissance team into the abandoned facility, officially designated as a structural assessment mission to evaluate the site for potential environmental cleanup. But Morrison's gut told him there was more to it than checking for asbestos and lead paint. His team consisted of specialists from the 4th Special Operations Support Battalion, men who'd earned their stripes in places that didn't exist on any official maps, carrying out missions that were immediately classified upon completion. The orders came down from so high up the chain of command that even Morrison's commanding officer seemed nervous when he handed over the sealed envelope containing their operational parameters, his hands trembling slightly as he emphasized that radio silence was to be maintained at all costs once they entered the facility perimeter. The drive up the winding mountain road to Fort Blackwood took them through 40 miles of pristine Colorado wilderness, past warning signs that grew increasingly ominous as they climbed higher into the thin mountain air. Staff Sergeant Maria Ghost Rodriguez, the team's demolitions expert and former EOD specialist, kept checking her instruments and muttering in Spanish, a habit she'd picked up during 3 tours in Afghanistan, where her uncanny ability to detect improvised explosives had earned her both her nickname and a chest full of commendations. Beside her sat Corporal Tommy Doc Chen, a combat medic whose baby face and wire-rimmed glasses hid the fact that he'd performed emergency surgery in more bombed-out buildings than most trauma surgeons see in a lifetime. His medical kit expanded with equipment that suggested the brass expected them to encounter more than structural damage. The facility itself loomed out of the morning fog like something from a Cold War fever dream. A massive concrete and steel complex built directly into the mountainside, its brutalist architecture designed more for concealment and containment than comfort, with blast doors that looked like they could withstand a direct nuclear strike and observation towers that still swept the surrounding terrain with automated cameras despite being officially deactivated. What should have been a routine inspection quickly revealed itself to be something far more complicated than anyone had briefed them to expect. The main entrance required Morrison to input a security code that hadn't appeared in any of their mission documents. Yet somehow the Master Sergeant found the correct sequence burned into his memory like a half-remembered nightmare, his fingers moving across the keypad with muscle memory he couldn't explain. The interior of Fort Blackwood was a labyrinth of sterile corridors and reinforced chambers that stretched deep into the mountain's core. The walls lined with thick lead plating that made their radio equipment useless and created an oppressive sense of isolation that seemed to press against their skulls like a physical weight. Emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly red glow that made shadows dance in ways that defied the laws of physics, and the air recycling system still hummed with mechanical efficiency, despite the facility's supposed abandonment. Circulating atmosphere that tasted of ozone and something indefinably organic that made Doc Chen check his air quality readings 3 times before he trusted the numbers. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong with Fort Blackwood came during their initial sweep of Level B2, when Rodriguez's demolition sensors began detecting trace amounts of chemical compounds that shouldn't have existed in nature, let alone in an abandoned military facility that had supposedly been mothballed for over 3 decades. The readings showed complex molecular structures that her equipment couldn't properly identify, organic compounds that seemed to shift and change their chemical signatures, even as she watched the display creating patterns that defied everything she'd learned about explosive detection during her years of training. What really unsettled her wasn't the mysterious readings themselves, but the way they seemed to follow the team as they moved through the corridors, always staying just at the edge of her sensor's range like some invisible presence that was deliberately avoiding direct detection. Morrison initially dismissed her concerns as equipment malfunction. The facility's electromagnetic shielding could easily interfere with sensitive electronics, after all. But when Doc Chen's medical scanners began picking up similar anomalies, measuring biological signatures that registered as simultaneously living and dead, the Master Sergeant's skepticism started giving way to the kind of professional paranoia that had kept him alive through 2 decades of black operations. The temperature fluctuations started on their second day inside the facility, sudden drops of 20 to 30 degrees that would hit without warning, turning their breath into visible clouds despite the supposedly climate-controlled environment that maintained a steady 72 degrees throughout the complex. These cold spots weren't random or related to the ventilation system. They followed specific patterns that seemed almost intelligent in their placement, appearing in doorways just as team members were about to cross thresholds, manifesting in corridors that had been perfectly comfortable just moments before, creating pockets of Arctic air that felt thick and viscous like walking through invisible syrup. Doc Chen, whose medical training made him naturally skeptical of supernatural explanations, tried to rationalize the phenomenon by checking the facility's environmental controls, only to discover that the heating system was functioning perfectly and all temperature sensors read normal levels even when the team was standing in areas where their breath came out in frigid puffs. The really disturbing aspect wasn't the cold itself, but what came with it. A smell that none of them could properly describe, something that reminded Morrison of the morgues he'd visited during casualty identification duty, mixed with the ozone scent of high-voltage electrical equipment, and an underlying sweetness that made their stomachs turn and their mouths water simultaneously. By the 3rd day, all 3 team members were experiencing auditory phenomena that couldn't be explained by structural settling or mechanical systems operating in the abandoned facility. It started as barely perceptible sounds at the very edge of human hearing, whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, electronic beeping that didn't correspond to any equipment they were carrying, and a rhythmic tapping that followed a pattern too complex to be random, but too irregular to be mechanical. Rodriguez, whose demolitions work had given her exceptional hearing for detecting the subtle sounds that indicated hidden explosives, was the first to notice that the whispers weren't in English or any language she could identify, but they carried emotional undertones that transcended linguistic barriers: desperation, fear, and an overwhelming sense of urgency that made her unconsciously check her equipment more frequently and look over her shoulder even when she knew her teammates were accounted for. The sounds grew stronger in certain areas of the facility, particularly near the sealed sections that their mission briefing had specifically told them to avoid. And Chen's medical equipment began registering physiological responses in all three team members that indicated extreme stress, even when they felt relatively calm and in control of the situation. Morrison's military training had taught him that every mystery has a logical explanation, and his first instinct was to find the rational cause behind the increasingly bizarre phenomena plaguing their reconnaissance mission at Fort Blackwood. Using his security clearance, he accessed the facility's partially corrupted computer archives, diving deep into decades-old files that painted a disturbing picture of what had really transpired within these concrete walls during the height of the Cold War. The official designation training facility Alpha 7 was apparently a cover story for something called Project Mindbridge, a joint CIA military intelligence operation that had been conducting psychological warfare experiments on volunteer subjects from 1962 to 1987, with a particular focus on what the classified documents euphemistically termed consciousness manipulation and remote viewing capabilities. The files detailed years of research into sensory deprivation, chemical enhancement of psychic abilities, and something called dimensional interface protocols that made Morrison's blood run cold as he read through page after page of clinical reports describing test subjects who had experienced catastrophic neural feedback during attempts to project their consciousness beyond the physical limitations of the human body. What made his hands shake as he scrolled through the digital records wasn't just the horrific nature of the experiments themselves, but the realization that many of the test subjects had been soldiers just like him, volunteers who had signed up for what they thought were routine psychological evaluations, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare of government-sanctioned torture disguised as scientific research. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez discovered a hidden maintenance passage behind a false wall in the facility's central laboratory complex, revealing access to the sealed sections that their mission briefing had explicitly forbidden them from entering. Her demolitions expertise allowed her to identify the structural weak points in the concrete barriers that had been hastily erected to isolate entire wings of Fort Blackwood, and what they found beyond those improvised walls defied every rational explanation Morrison had been clinging to since their arrival. The sealed laboratories were perfectly preserved, as if the researchers had simply walked away in the middle of their work and never returned. Test chambers filled with sensory deprivation tanks that still hummed with electrical current, monitoring equipment that registered brainwave patterns despite the absence of any test subjects, and walls covered with charts and graphs, documenting the neurological responses of dozens of experimental subjects whose names had been redacted from the official records. Most disturbing of all were the audio logs they discovered in the chief researcher's office recordings of sessions where test subjects reported making contact with entities that existed outside normal space-time, describing encounters with intelligences that claimed to have been waiting between the spaces for someone to open a doorway that would allow them to cross over into physical reality. The second major incident occurred that night, as the team was processing the implications of their discoveries in the relative safety of their temporary command post in the facility's main lobby. At exactly 2:47 a.m., every piece of electronic equipment in Fort Blackwood activated simultaneously. Computers that had been powered down for decades suddenly blazed to life, running programs that displayed incomprehensible data streams across their monitors, while the facility's intercom system crackled with voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization by millennia. The lights throughout the complex began flickering in patterns that Chen's medical training recognized as similar to brainwave activity, specifically the irregular neural firing associated with severe psychological trauma or death throes, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that ice began forming on their weapons and equipment. Morrison felt his rational worldview crumbling as he watched security cameras throughout the facility, tracking movement in corridors that should have been empty, their automated systems following shapes that appeared as nothing more than static distortions on the monitors but cast shadows that were clearly visible to the naked eye when he looked down the actual hallways. Rodriguez crossed herself for the first time since childhood as her demolition sensors went haywire, detecting massive quantities of an explosive compound that her equipment identified as C4, but which gave off energy readings that were orders of magnitude beyond anything conventional explosives could produce, as if the very atoms in the air around them were being excited to the point of potential detonation by some invisible force that operated according to physics laws that hadn't been discovered by human science. The final confrontation with whatever had been unleashed at Fort Blackwood began during their fourth night in the facility, when the barrier between dimensions that the original researchers had somehow weakened finally collapsed completely under the weight of accumulated psychic trauma from decades of failed experiments. Morrison was reviewing the audio logs in the main laboratory when the sensory deprivation tanks throughout the sealed section suddenly began filling themselves with a viscous, luminescent fluid that seemed to pulse with its own internal light, creating an otherworldly glow that cast dancing shadows across walls covered with charts documenting the final moments of test subjects who had never returned from their journeys into what the files called liminal space. The temperature in the room plummeted to sub-zero levels so quickly that the moisture in their breath crystallized before it could disperse, and every reflective surface in the laboratory began showing images that weren't actually present in the physical space. Distorted faces pressed against the glass from the other side, mouths open in silent screams, eyes filled with a desperate hunger that transcended human understanding. Rodriguez watched in horrified fascination as her demolitions equipment detected the presence of materials that violated the fundamental laws of matter and energy substances that registered as both solid and gaseous, simultaneously existing in multiple states of being that should have been impossible according to everything she'd learned about chemistry and physics during her military training. The entities themselves began manifesting as the facility's original test subjects, but transformed by their prolonged exposure to whatever existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality into something that was no longer entirely human. Doc Chen's medical scanners went completely haywire as shapes began materializing in the laboratory around them. Figures that appeared to be wearing military uniforms from different eras of Fort Blackwood's operation, their faces bearing expressions of confusion and terror as if they were still experiencing the psychological trauma that had killed them decades earlier. These weren't traditional ghosts or spirits, but rather fragments of human consciousness that had become entangled with alien intelligences during the original experiments, creating hybrid entities that possessed knowledge of both human military procedures and cosmic truths that human minds weren't designed to comprehend. The apparitions moved through the laboratory with jerky, unnatural motions, their forms constantly shifting between solid matter and transparent energy, reaching out toward Morrison and his team with hands that passed through physical objects one moment and left frost burns on metal surfaces the next. What terrified the three soldiers most wasn't the supernatural nature of these entities, but the recognition that they still retained enough human intelligence to communicate, speaking in voices that combined the technical jargon of military personnel with alien concepts that made their ears bleed and their vision blur when they tried to process the meaning behind words that shouldn't exist in any human language. Morrison realized with growing horror that the entities weren't trying to harm them, but rather to warn them about something far worse that was using Fort Blackwood as an entry point into physical reality. The original experiments had apparently created a permanent dimensional breach that allowed things from between the spaces to observe and interact with the human world, and the traumatized consciousness fragments of the test subjects were desperately trying to communicate that the facility needed to be completely destroyed before these cosmic predators could establish a permanent foothold in our dimension. Rodriguez felt her sanity slipping as her equipment detected energy signatures that suggested the very structure of space-time around Fort Blackwood was becoming unstable with localized gravity distortions that made their weapons feel impossibly heavy one moment and weightless the next. Doc Chen's medical training became useless as he watched his instruments measure physiological responses that indicated all 3 team members were simultaneously alive, dead, and existing in states of being that medical science had no terminology to describe their cellular structure, fluctuating between normal human biology and something that registered as both organic and crystalline. The laboratory filled with sounds that bypassed their ears entirely and resonated directly in their bones. Frequencies that carried information about the true nature of reality, cosmic truths that human consciousness wasn't equipped to process without suffering permanent psychological damage, and warnings about entities that viewed human intelligence the way humans viewed bacteria cultures in a petri dish. Morrison's decades of special operations training kicked in even as his rational mind struggled to process the impossible reality surrounding them in the depths of Fort Blackwood's main laboratory. Understanding that conventional military tactics were useless against entities that existed partially outside normal space-time, he made the desperate decision to follow the warnings being communicated by the tortured consciousness fragments of the original test subjects, who kept pointing toward the facility's nuclear self-destruct system that had been installed during the Cold War as a final failsafe against Soviet infiltration. Rodriguez used her demolitions expertise to locate the manual activation controls for the facility's tactical nuclear device, a small-yield warhead designed to completely vaporize Fort Blackwood and everything within a 2-mile radius, while Doc Chen frantically gathered whatever evidence they could carry to document their discoveries for the outside world. The hybrid entities seemed to understand their intention and began providing assistance, guiding them through corridors that shifted and changed configuration like a living maze, protecting them from the cosmic predators that were already beginning to push through the dimensional breach in increasing numbers. As they made their way toward the surface through passages that felt increasingly unstable, Morrison realized that the traumatized soldiers who had died in the original experiments were making one final sacrifice, using their fragmented consciousness to hold back forces that would have consumed his team's sanity within minutes of direct contact. The escape from Fort Blackwood became a race against both time and the fundamental laws of physics, as the facility's dimensional breach continued to widen, allowing more of the alien intelligences to probe into physical reality with tentacles of pure thought that left frost burns on the concrete walls and filled the air with the smell of ozone and cosmic radiation. Rodriguez's demolitions timer gave them exactly 12 minutes to reach minimum safe distance before the nuclear device would detonate. But the corridors they had mapped during their initial reconnaissance were no longer following the same spatial relationships, with hallways that led in directions that shouldn't exist and stairwells that seemed to ascend and descend simultaneously. Doc Chen's medical equipment registered impossible physiological readings as they ran through passages where gravity operated according to alien physics, their bodies simultaneously experiencing the effects of zero-G weightlessness and crushing atmospheric pressure that should have killed them instantly, but somehow left them functional enough to keep moving toward what they hoped was still the surface exit. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of reality itself being torn apart as the cosmic predators grew bolder in their attempts to establish permanent access to the human dimension, their alien communications creating harmonics that made the facility's steel reinforcements ring like tuning forks and caused spontaneous nosebleeds that left metallic-tasting blood running down their faces. When they finally burst through the main entrance of Fort Blackwood into the cold Colorado mountain air, all 3 team members collapsed from exhaustion and sensory overload, their bodies shaking uncontrollably as they watched the facility's blast doors seal themselves shut one final time, as if the hybrid entities were ensuring that nothing could escape the nuclear cleansing that was about to occur. The official investigation into the accidental detonation of Fort Blackwood's failsafe nuclear device concluded that a combination of aging electrical systems and seismic activity had triggered the warhead's automatic activation sequence, creating a tragic but necessary cleanup of what the Pentagon now claimed had been a contaminated research site requiring immediate sterilization. Morrison, Rodriguez, and Chen found themselves subjected to months of debriefing sessions with intelligence officers who seemed more interested in ensuring their silence than understanding what had really transpired in the depths of the Colorado facility. Their testimonies classified at levels so high that even they weren't allowed to read their own statements once they'd been transcribed and filed away in the same vault system that had hidden the original Project Mindbridge documents. All 3 team members were quietly transferred to different branches of the military and stationed on separate continents, with Morrison assigned to a logistics position in Germany, Rodriguez sent to a training facility in Japan, and Chen transferred to a medical research unit in Australia. Geographical separation designed to prevent them from comparing their experiences or developing a unified narrative that might contradict the official story of equipment malfunction and environmental contamination. Their exemplary service records were noted. Commendations were issued for their professionalism under extreme circumstances, and generous retirement packages were offered to encourage them to end their military careers and disappear into civilian life, where their stories would be dismissed as the PTSD-fueled fantasies of combat veterans who'd spent too much time in dangerous situations. But some truths refuse to stay buried. Regardless of how many classification stamps are applied or how thoroughly the evidence has been destroyed by tactical nuclear weapons, 25 years after the Fort Blackwood incident, Morrison still wakes up in his suburban Denver home hearing voices speaking in languages that predate human civilization, while Rodriguez has never been able to work with explosives again, claiming that she can sense dimensional instabilities in the chemical compounds that make her hands shake uncontrollably whenever she approaches anything more dangerous than 4th of July fireworks. Doc Chen, now a civilian physician working in a quiet practice in rural Montana, continues to experience periodic episodes where his vision shifts into spectrums beyond normal human perception, allowing him to see the thin places where reality wears through and other dimensions press against the boundaries of our physical universe, making him acutely aware of just how fragile the barrier is between our world and the cosmic predators that are always watching, always waiting for another opportunity to cross over into a reality where human consciousness provides the perfect anchor point for intelligences that view our planet as nothing more than a beachhead for interdimensional colonization. The 3 veterans maintain no official contact with each other, but they all know, with the certainty that comes from having stared directly into the abyss and somehow survived to tell about it, that Fort Blackwood was just one of hundreds of similar facilities scattered across the globe, and that the experiments conducted there in the name of national security may have opened doorways that can never truly be closed, only temporarily sealed until the next group of unsuspecting soldiers or researchers stumbles across the wrong classified file and decides to investigate what really lies hidden in those abandoned military installations, that don't appear on any public maps. The official story claims that Fort Blackwood was completely destroyed, but satellite imagery of the Colorado mountains shows a perfectly circular area of dead earth where nothing has grown for over 2 decades, as if the very soil remembers what emerged from beneath those concrete walls and refuses to support life that might provide another pathway for entities that exist between the spaces of normal reality. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more military mysteries. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any stories. See you in the next video.